usually think of rhythm as an element of music, but it's actually found everywhere in the world around us. From the ocean tides to our own heartbeats, rhythm is essentially an event repeating regularly over time. Even the ticking of a clock itself is a sort of rhythm. But for musical rhythm, a steady string of repeating single beats is not enough. For that, we need at least one opposing beat with a different sound, which can be the unstressed offbeat or the accented backbeat. There are several ways to make these beats distinct, whether by using high and low drums or long and short beats. Which ends up being heard as the main beat is not a precise rule, but like the famous Rubens vase, can be reversed depending on cultural perception. In standard notation, rhythm is indicated on a musical bar line. But there are other ways. Remember that ticking clock? Just as its round face can trace the linear passage of time, the flow of rhythm can be traced in a circle. The continuity of a wheel can be a more intuitive way to visualize rhythm than a linear score that requires moving back and forth along the page. We can mark the beats at different positions around a circle, using blue dots for main beats, orange ones for off beats, and white dots for secondary beats. Here is a basic 2-beat rhythm with a main beat and an opposing offbeat. Or a 3-beat rhythm with a main beat, an offbeat, and a secondary beat. And the spaces between each beat can be divided into further sub-beats using multiples of either 2 or 3. Layering multiple patterns using concentric wheels lets us create more complex rhythms. For example, we can combine a basic 2-beat rhythm with offbeats to get a 4-beat system. This is the recognizable backbone of many genres popular around the world, from rock, country, and jazz, to reggae and cumbia. Or we can combine a 2-beat rhythm with a 3-beat one. Eliminating the extra main beat and rotating the inner wheel leaves us with a rhythm whose underlying feel is 3/4. This is the basis of the music of whirling dervishes, as well as a broad range of Latin American rhythms, such as joropo, and even Bach's famous chaconne. Now, if we remember Rubens' vase and hear the offbeats as the main beats, this will give us a 6/8 feel, as found in genres such as chacarera and cueca, Persian music, and more. In an 8-beat system, we have 3 layered circles, each rhythm played by a different instrument. We can then add an outermost layer consisting of an additive rhythmic component, reinforcing the main beat and increasing accuracy. Now let's remove everything except for this combined rhythm and the basic 2-beat on top. This rhythmic configuration is found as the Cuban cinquillo, in the Puerto Rican bomba, and in northern Romanian music. And rotating the outer circle 90 degrees counterclockwise gives us a pattern often found in Middle Eastern music. As well as Brazilian choro and Argentinian tango. In all of these examples, the underlying rhythm reinforces the basic 1-2, but in different ways depending on arrangement and cultural context. So it turns out that the wheel method is more than just a nifty way of visualizing complex rhythms. By freeing us from the tyranny of the bar line, we can visualize rhythm in terms of time, and a simple turn of the wheel can take us on a musical journey around the world. In the 1920s, the German mathematician David Hilbert devised a famous thought experiment to show us just how hard it is to wrap our minds around the concept of infinity. Imagine a hotel with an infinite number of rooms and a very hard-working night manager. One night, the infinite hotel is completely full, totally booked up with an infinite number of guests. A man walks into the hotel and asks for a room. Rather than turn him down, the night manager decides to make room for him. How? Easy. He asks the guest in room number 1 to move to room 2, the guest in room 2 to move to room 3, and so on. Every guest moves from room number n to room number n plus 1. Since there are an infinite number of rooms, there is a new room for each existing guest. This leaves room 1 open for the new customer. The process can be repeated for any finite number of new guests. If, say, a tour bus unloads 40 new people looking for rooms, then every existing guest just moves from room number n to room number n plus 40, thus opening up the first 40 rooms. But now, an infinitely large bus with a countably infinite number of passengers pulls up to rent rooms. Countably infinite is the key. Now, the infinite bus of infinite passengers perplexes the night manager at first, but he realizes there's a way to place each new person. He asks the guest in room 1 to move to room 2. He then asks the guest in room 2 to move to room 4, the guest in room 3 to move to room 6, and so on. Each current guest moves from room number n to room number 2n, filling up only the infinite even-numbered rooms. By doing this, he has now emptied all of the infinitely many odd-numbered rooms, which are then taken by the people filing off the infinite bus. Everyone's happy, and the hotel's business is booming more than ever. Well, actually, it is booming exactly the same amount as ever, banking an infinite number of dollars a night. Word spreads about this incredible hotel. People pour in from far and wide. One night, the unthinkable happens. The night manager looks outside and sees an infinite line of infinitely large buses, each with a countably infinite number of passengers. What can he do? If he cannot find rooms for them, the hotel will lose out on an infinite amount of money, and he will surely lose his job. Luckily, he remembers that around the year 300 BCE, Euclid proved that there is an infinite quantity of prime numbers. So to accomplish this seemingly impossible task of finding infinite beds for infinite buses of infinite weary travelers, the night manager assigns every current guest to the first prime number, 2, raised to the power of their current room number. So the current occupant of room number 7 goes to room number 2 to the 7th power, which is room 128. The night manager then takes the people on the first of the infinite buses and assigns them to the room number of the next prime, 3, raised to the power of their seat number on the bus. So the person in seat number 7 on the first bus goes to room number 3 to the 7th power, or room number 2187. This continues for all of the first bus. The passengers on the second bus are assigned powers of the next prime, 5. The following bus, powers of 7. Each bus follows powers of 11, powers of 13, powers of 17, etc. Since each of these numbers only has 1 and the natural number powers of their prime number base as factors, there are no overlapping room numbers. All the bus's passengers fan out into rooms using unique room assignment schemes based on unique prime numbers. In this way, the night manager can accommodate every passenger on every bus, although there will be many rooms that go unfilled, like room 6, since 6 is not a power of any prime number. Luckily, his bosses weren't very good in math, so his job is safe. The night manager's strategies are only possible because while the infinite hotel is certainly a logistical nightmare, it only deals with the lowest level of infinity, namely the countable infinity of the natural numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. Georg Cantor called this level of infinity Aleph 0. We use natural numbers for the room numbers as well as the seat numbers on the buses. If we were dealing with higher orders of infinity, such as that of the real numbers, these structured strategies would no longer be possible, as we have no way to systematically include every number. The real number infinite hotel has negative number rooms in the basement, fractional rooms, So the guy in room 1/2 always suspects he has less room than the guy in room 1. Square root rooms, like room radical 2, and room pi, where the guests expect free dessert. What self-respecting night manager would ever want to work there, even for an infinite salary? But over at Hilbert's Infinite Hotel, where there's never any vacancy and always room for more, the scenarios faced by the ever-diligent and maybe too hospitable night manager serve to remind us of just how hard it is for our relatively finite minds to grasp a concept as large as infinity. Maybe you can help tackle these problems after a good night's sleep, but honestly, we might need you to change rooms at 2 a.m.
Sorry, my phone died. It's nothing. I'm fine. These allegations are completely unfounded. The company was not aware of any wrongdoing. I love you. We hear anywhere from 10 to 200 lies a day, and we spent much of our history coming up with ways to detect them. From medieval torture devices to polygraphs, blood pressure and breathing monitors, voice stress analyzers, eye trackers, infrared brain scanners, and even the 400-pound electroencephalogram. But although such tools have worked under certain circumstances, most can be fooled with enough preparation, and none are considered reliable enough to even be admissible in court. But what if the problem is not with the techniques, but the underlying assumption that lying spurs physiological changes? What if we took a more direct approach, using communication science to analyze the lies themselves? On a psychological level, we lie partly to paint a better picture of ourselves, connecting our fantasies to the person we wish we were rather than the person we are. But while our brain is busy dreaming, it's letting plenty of signals slip by. Our conscious mind only controls about 5% of our cognitive function, including communication, while the other 95% occurs beyond our awareness. And according to the literature on reality monitoring, stories based on imagined experiences are qualitatively different from those based on real experiences. This suggests that creating a false story about a personal topic takes work and results in a different pattern of language use. A technology known as linguistic text analysis has helped to identify 4 such common patterns in the subconscious language of deception. First, liars reference themselves less when making deceptive statements. They write or talk more about others, often using the third person to distance and disassociate themselves from their lie. Which sounds more false? Absolutely no party took place at this house, or I didn't host a party here. Second, liars tend to be more negative, because on a subconscious level, they feel guilty about lying. For example, a liar might say something like, "Sorry, my stupid phone battery died. I hate that thing." Third, liars typically explain events in simple terms, since our brains struggle to build a complex lie. Judgment and evaluation are complex things for our brains to compute. As a U.S. president once famously insisted, "I did not have sexual relations with that woman." And finally, even though liars keep descriptions simple, they tend to use longer and more convoluted sentence structure, inserting unnecessary words and irrelevant but factual-sounding details in order to pad the lie. Another president confronted with a scandal proclaimed, "I can say categorically that this investigation indicates that no one on the White House staff, no one in this administration presently employed was involved in this very bizarre incident." Let's apply linguistic analysis to some famous examples. Take 7-time Tour de France winner Lance Armstrong. When comparing a 2005 interview in which he had denied taking performance-enhancing drugs to a 2013 interview in which he admitted it, his use of personal pronouns increased by nearly 3/4. Note the contrast between the following 2 quotes. First, "Okay, a guy in a Parisian laboratory opens up your sample, Jean-Francis so-and-so, and he tests it. And then you get a phone call from a newspaper that says, 'We found you to be positive 6 times for EPO.' Second, I lost myself in all of that. I'm sure there would be other people that couldn't handle it, but I certainly couldn't handle it, and I was used to controlling everything in my life. I controlled every outcome in my life." In his denial, Armstrong described a hypothetical situation focused on someone else, removing himself from the situation entirely. In his admission, he owns his statements, delving into his personal emotions and motivations. But the use of personal pronouns is just one indicator of deception. Let's look at another example from former Senator and U.S. presidential candidate John Edwards. I only know that the apparent father has said publicly that he is the father of the baby. I also have not been engaged in any activity of any description that requested, agreed to, or supported payments of any kind to the woman or to the apparent father of the baby. Not only is that a pretty long-winded way to say, the baby isn't mine, but Edwards never calls the other parties by name, instead saying, that baby, the woman, and the apparent father. Now let's see what he had to say when later admitting paternity. I am Quinn's father. I will do everything in my power to provide her with the love and support she deserves. The statement is short and direct, calling the child by name and addressing his role in her life. So how can you apply these lie-spotting techniques to your life? First, remember that many of the lies we encounter on a daily basis are far less serious than these examples, and may even be harmless. But it's still worthwhile to be aware of telltale clues like minimal self-references, negative language, simple explanations, and convoluted phrasing. It just might help you avoid an overvalued stock, an ineffective product, or even a terrible relationship.
On a typical day at school, endless hours are spent learning the answers to questions. But right now, we'll do the opposite. We're going to focus on questions where you can't learn the answers because they're unknown. I used to puzzle about a lot of things as a boy. For example, what would it feel like to be a dog? Do fish feel pain? Well, how about insects? Was the Big Bang just an accident? I mean, is there a God? And if so, how are we so sure that it's a he and not a she? And why do so many innocent people and animals suffer terrible things? Is there really a plan for my life? Is the future yet to be written? Or is it already written and we just can't see it? But then, do I have free will? I mean, who am I anyway? Am I just a biological machine? But then, why am I conscious? What is consciousness? Will robots become conscious one day? I mean, I kind of assumed that someday I would be told the answers to all these questions. I mean, someone must know, right? Guess what? No one knows. Most of those questions puzzle me more now than ever. But diving into them is exciting because it takes you to the edge of knowledge and you never know what you'll find there. So, 2 questions that no one on earth knows the answer to. Sometimes when I'm on a long plane flight, I gaze out at all those mountains and deserts and try to get my head around how vast our Earth is. And then I remember there's an object we see every day that would literally fit 1 million Earths inside it. The sun seems impossibly big, but in the great scheme of things, it's a pinprick, one of about 400 billion stars in the Milky Way galaxy, which you can see on a clear night as a pale white mist stretched across the sky. And it gets worse. There are maybe 100 billion galaxies detectable by our telescopes. So if each star was the size of a single grain of sand, just the Milky Way has enough stars to fill a 30-foot by 30-foot stretch of beach, 3 feet deep with sand. And the entire Earth doesn't have enough beaches to represent the stars in the overall universe. Such a beach would continue for literally hundreds of millions of miles. Holy Stephen Hawking, that is a lot of stars. But he and other physicists now believe in a reality that is unimaginably bigger still. I mean, first of all, the 100 billion galaxies within range of our telescopes are probably a minuscule fraction of the total. Space itself is expanding at an accelerating pace. The vast majority of the galaxies are separating from us so fast that light from them may never reach us. Still, our physical reality here on Earth is intimately connected to those distant invisible galaxies. We can think of them as part of our universe. They make up a single giant edifice, obeying the same physical laws and all made from the same types of atoms, electrons, protons, quarks, neutrinos that make up you and me. However, recent theories in physics, including one called string theory, are now telling us there could be countless other universes built on different types of particles with different properties, obeying different laws. Most of these universes could never support life and might flash in and out of existence in a nanosecond. But nonetheless, combined, they make up a vast multiverse of possible universes in up to 11 dimensions, featuring wonders beyond our wildest imagination. And the leading version of string theory predicts a multiverse made up of 10 to the 500 universes. It's a 1 followed by 500 zeros. A number so vast that if every atom in our observable universe had its own universe, and all of the atoms in all those universes each had their own universe, and you repeated that for 2 more cycles, you'd still be at a tiny fraction of the total. Namely, 1 trillion, 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 trillionth. But even that number is minuscule compared to another number, infinity. Some physicists think the space-time continuum is literally infinite and that it contains an infinite number of so-called pocket universes with varying properties. How's your brain doing? Quantum theory adds a whole new wrinkle. I mean, the theory's been proven true beyond all doubt, but interpreting it is baffling, and some physicists think you can only unbaffle it if you imagine that huge numbers of parallel universes are being spawned every moment. And many of these universes would actually be very like the world we're in, would include multiple copies of you. In one such universe, you graduate with honors and marry the person of your dreams. In another, not so much. Well, there are still some scientists who would say hogwash. The only meaningful answer to the question of how many universes there are is one. Only one universe. And a few philosophers and mystics might argue that even our own universe is an illusion. So as you can see right now, there is no agreement on this question, not even close. All we know is the answer is somewhere between 0 and infinity. Well, I guess we know one other thing. This is a pretty cool time to be studying physics. We just might be undergoing the biggest paradigm shift in knowledge that humanity has ever seen. Somewhere out there in that vast universe, there must surely be countless other planets teeming with life. But why don't we see any evidence of it? Well, this is the famous question asked by Enrico Fermi in 1950. Where is everybody? Conspiracy theorists claim that UFOs are visiting all the time and the reports are just being covered up. But honestly, they aren't very convincing. But that leaves a real riddle. In the past year, the Kepler Space Observatory has found hundreds of planets just around nearby stars. And if you extrapolate that data, it looks like there could be 500 billion planets just in our own galaxy. If only 1 in 10,000 has conditions that might support a form of life, that's still 50 million possible life-harboring planets right here in the Milky Way. So here's the riddle. Our Earth didn't form until about 9 billion years after the Big Bang. Countless other planets in our galaxy should have formed earlier and given life a chance to get underway billions, or certainly many millions of years earlier than happened on Earth. If just a few of them had spawned intelligent life and started creating technologies, those technologies would have had millions of years to grow in complexity and power. On Earth, we've seen how dramatically technology can accelerate in just 100 years. In millions of years, an intelligent alien civilization could easily have spread out across the galaxy, perhaps creating giant energy-harvesting artifacts, or fleets of colonizing spaceships, or glorious works of art that fill the night sky. At the very least, you'd think they'd be revealing their presence, deliberately or otherwise, through electromagnetic signals of one kind or another. And yet we see no convincing evidence of any of it. Why? Well, there are numerous possible answers, some of them quite dark. Maybe a single superintelligent civilization has indeed taken over the galaxy and has imposed strict radio silence because it's paranoid of any potential competitors. It's just sitting there ready to obliterate anything that becomes a threat. Or maybe they're not that intelligent. Or perhaps the evolution of an intelligence capable of creating sophisticated technology is far rarer than we've assumed. After all, it's only happened once on Earth in 4 billion years. Maybe even that was incredibly lucky. Maybe we are the first such civilization in our galaxy. Or perhaps civilization carries with it the seeds of its own destruction through the inability to control the technologies it creates. But there are numerous more hopeful answers. I mean, for a start, we're not looking that hard, and we're spending a pitiful amount of money on it. Only a tiny fraction of the stars in our galaxy have really been looked at closely for signs of interesting signals. And perhaps we're not looking the right way. Maybe as civilizations develop, they quickly discover communication technologies far more sophisticated and useful than electromagnetic waves. Maybe all the action takes place inside the mysterious, recently discovered dark matter or dark energy that appear to account for most of the universe's mass. Or maybe we're looking at the wrong scale. Perhaps intelligent civilizations come to realize that life is ultimately just complex patterns of information interacting with each other in a beautiful way, and that can happen more efficiently at a small scale. So just as on Earth, clunky stereo systems have shrunk to beautiful tiny iPods, maybe intelligent life itself, in order to reduce its footprint on the environment, has turned itself microscopic, so that the solar system might be teeming with aliens and we're just not noticing them. Maybe the very ideas in our heads are a form of alien life. Well, okay, that's a crazy thought. The aliens made me say it. But it is cool that ideas do seem to have a life all of their own, and that they outlive their creators. Maybe biological life is just a passing phase. Well, within the next 15 years, we could start seeing real spectroscopic information from promising nearby planets that will reveal just how life-friendly they might be. And meanwhile, SETI, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, is now releasing its data to the public so that millions of citizen scientists, maybe including you, can bring the power of the crowd to join the search. And here on Earth, amazing experiments are being done to try to create life from scratch, life that might be very different from the DNA forms we know. All of this will help us understand whether the universe is teeming with life, or whether indeed it's just us. Either answer, in its own way, is awe-inspiring. Because even if we are alone, the fact that we think and dream and ask these questions might yet turn out to be one of the most important facts about the universe. And I have one more piece of good news for you. The quest for knowledge and understanding never gets dull. It doesn't. It's actually the opposite. The more you know, the more amazing the world seems. And it's the crazy possibilities, the unanswered questions that pull us forward. So, stay curious.
Have you ever noticed something swimming in your field of vision? It may look like a tiny worm or a transparent blob. And whenever you try to get a closer look, it disappears, only to reappear as soon as you shift your glance. But don't go rinsing out your eyes. What you are seeing is a common phenomenon known as a floater. The scientific name for these objects is Muscae volitantes, Latin for flying flies, and true to their name, they can be somewhat annoying. But they're not actually bugs or any kind of external objects at all. Rather, they exist inside your eyeball. Floaters may seem to be alive since they move and change shape, but they are not alive. Floaters are tiny objects that cast shadows on the retina, the light-sensitive tissue at the back of your eye. They might be bits of tissue, red blood cells, or clumps of protein. And because they're suspended within the vitreous humor, the gel-like liquid that fills the inside of your eye, Floaters drift along with your eye movements and seem to bounce a little when your eye stops. Floaters may be only barely distinguishable most of the time. They become more visible the closer they are to the retina, just as holding your hand closer to a table with an overhead light will result in a more sharply defined shadow. And floaters are particularly noticeable when you are looking at a uniform bright surface, like a blank computer screen, snow, or a clear sky, where the consistency of the background makes them easier to distinguish. The brighter the light is, the more your pupil contracts. This has an effect similar to replacing a large diffuse light fixture with a single overhead light bulb, which also makes the shadow appear clearer. There is another visual phenomenon that looks similar to floaters, but is in fact unrelated. If you've seen tiny dots of light darting about when looking at a bright blue sky, you've experienced what is known as the blue field entoptic phenomenon. In some ways, this is the opposite of seeing floaters. Here, you are not seeing shadows, but little moving windows letting light through to your retina. The windows are actually caused by white blood cells moving through the capillaries along your retina surface. These leukocytes can be so large that they nearly fill a capillary, causing a plasma space to open up in front of them. Because the space and the white blood cells are both more transparent to blue light than the red blood cells normally present in capillaries, we see a moving dot of light wherever this happens, following the paths of your capillaries and moving in time with your pulse. Under ideal viewing conditions, you might even see what looks like a dark tail following the dot. This is the red blood cells that have bunched up behind the leukocyte. Some science museums have an exhibit which consists of a screen of blue light, allowing you to see these blue sky sprites much more clearly than you normally would. While everybody's eyes experience these sort of effects, the number and type vary greatly. In the case of floaters, they often go unnoticed as our brain learns to ignore them. However, abnormally numerous or large floaters that interfere with vision may be a sign of a more serious condition, requiring immediate medical treatment. But the majority of the time, entoptic phenomena, such as floaters and blue sky sprites, are just a gentle reminder that what we think we see depends just as much on our biology and minds as it does on the external world.
Our story is about a girl named Iris. Iris is very sensitive, so much that she is always in tears. She cries when she's sad, when she's happy, and even tears up when things just get to her. She has special lacrimal glands to make new tears and special tubes called lacrimal puncta to drain old ones away. And she cries so much that she goes through 10 ounces of tears per day, 30 gallons a year. In fact, if you look closely, you'll see that she's crying a little bit all the time. The basal tears that Iris constantly produces form a thin coating of 3 layers that cover her and keep dirt and debris away. Right next to Iris is the mucus layer, which keeps the whole thing fastened to her. On top of it is the aqueous layer, which keeps Iris hydrated, repels invasive bacteria, and protects her skin, or cornea, from damage. And finally, there is the lipid layer, an oily outer film that keeps the surface smooth for Iris to see through and prevents the other layers from evaporating. Normally, Iris goes about her day without really noticing the basal tears doing their thing. That's kind of their whole point. But one day, she meets a girl named Onion. Iris is immediately smitten. Onion looks gorgeous in her bright purple jacket, and she smells terrific. So Iris invites Onion to her house for dinner. But when she comes in and takes off her jacket, something terrible happens. You see, when Onion's jacket is removed, a chemical reaction happens, converting the sulfoxides that made her smell so great into sulfenic acid, which then becomes a nasty substance with a long name. Synpropanethiol S-oxide. The gas stings Iris, and suddenly she can't help it. She starts weeping uncontrollably. These reflex tears are different from the basal tears that Iris is used to. Because they're designed to wash away harmful substances or particles, they're released in much larger amounts, and their aqueous layer contains more antibodies to stop any microorganisms that may be trying to get in as well. Both Iris and Onion are devastated. They know they can't continue their relationship if Iris is going to hurt and cry every time Onion takes off her jacket, so they decide to break up. As Onion walks out the door, Iris stops crying and immediately starts again. Only now she's not crying reflex tears, but emotional tears. When someone is either too sad or too happy, it feels like a loss of control, which can be dangerous. So emotional tears are sent in to stabilize the mood as quickly as possible, along with other physical reactions such as an increased heart rate and slower breathing. But scientists still aren't sure exactly how or why the tears themselves are helpful. They may be a social mechanism to elicit sympathy or show submission. But some studies have also found that emotional tears contain higher levels of stress hormones, such as ACTH and enkephalin, an endorphin and natural painkiller. In this case, emotional tears are also directly calming Iris down, as well as signaling her emotional state to others. Sorry things didn't work out with Onion, Iris, but don't worry. As long as you have all three kinds of tears working to keep you balanced and healthy, it will get better. You'll see. They're cute, they're lovable, and judging by the 26 billion views of over 2 million YouTube videos of them pouncing, bouncing, climbing, cramming, stalking, clawing, chattering, and purring, one thing is certain: cats are very entertaining. These somewhat strange feline behaviors, both amusing and baffling, leave many of us asking, why do cats do that? Throughout time, cats were simultaneously solitary predators of smaller animals and prey for larger carnivores. As both predator and prey, survival of their species depended on crucial instinctual behaviors, which we still observe in wild and domestic cats today. While the feline actions of your house cat Grizmo might seem perplexing, in the wild, these same behaviors, naturally bred into cats for millions of years, would make Grizmo a super cat. Enabled by their unique muscular structure and keen balancing abilities, cats climbed to high vantage points to survey their territory and spot prey in the wild. Grizmo doesn't need these particular skills to find and hunt down dinner in her food bowl today, but instinctually, viewing the living room from the top of the bookcase is exactly what she has evolved to do. As wild predators, cats are opportunistic and hunt whenever prey is available. Since most cat prey are small, cats in the wild needed to eat many times each day and use a stalk, pounce, kill, eat strategy to stay fed. This is why Grizmo prefers to chase and pounce on little toys and eat small meals over the course of the day and night. Also, small prey tend to hide in tiny spaces in their natural environments. So one explanation for Grizmo's propensity to reach into containers and openings is that she is compelled by the same curiosity that helped ensure the continuation of her species for millions of years before. In the wild, cats needed sharp claws for climbing, hunting, and self-defense. Sharpening their claws on nearby surfaces kept them conditioned and ready, helped stretch their back and leg muscles, and relieved some stress too. So it's not that Grizmo hates your couch, chair, ottoman, pillows, curtains, and everything else you put in her environment. She's ripping these things to shreds and keeping her claws in tip-top shape, because this is exactly what her ancestors did in order to survive. As animals that were preyed upon, cats evolved to not get caught, and in the wild, the cats that were the best at avoiding predators thrived. So at your house today, Grizmo is an expert at squeezing into small spaces and seeking out and hiding in unconventional spots. It also explains why she prefers a clean and odor-free litter box. That's less likely to give away her location to any predators that may be sniffing around nearby. Considering everything we do know about cats, it seems that one of their most predominant behaviors is still one of the most mysterious. Cats may purr for any number of reasons, such as happiness, stress, and hunger. But curiously, the frequency of their purrs, between 25 and 150 hertz, is within a range that can promote tissue regeneration. So while her purring makes Grizmo an excellent nap companion, it is also possible that her purr is healing her muscles and bones, and maybe even yours too. They developed through time as both solitary predators that hunted and killed to eat, and stealthy prey that hid and escaped to survive. So cats today retain many of the same instincts that allowed them to thrive in the wild for millions of years. This explains some of their seemingly strange behaviors. To them, our homes are their jungles. But if this is the case, in our own cat's eyes, who are we? Big, dumb, hairless cats competing with them for resources? Terribly stupid predators they're able to outsmart every day? Or maybe they think we're the prey. Way before the first selfie, the ancient Greeks and Romans had a myth about someone a little too obsessed with his own image. In one telling, Narcissus was a handsome guy wandering the world in search of someone to love. After rejecting a nymph named Echo, he caught a glimpse of his own reflection in a river and fell in love with it. Unable to tear himself away, Narcissus drowned. A flower marked the spot where he died, and we call that flower the Narcissus. The myth captures the basic idea of narcissism, elevated and sometimes detrimental self-involvement. But it's not just a personality type that shows up in advice columns. It's actually a set of traits classified and studied by psychologists. The psychological definition of narcissism is an inflated, grandiose self-image. To varying degrees, narcissists think they're better looking, smarter, and more important than other people, and that they deserve special treatment. Psychologists recognize two forms of narcissism as a personality trait: grandiose and vulnerable narcissism. There's also narcissistic personality disorder, a more extreme form, which we'll return to shortly. Grandiose narcissism is the most familiar kind, characterized by extroversion, dominance, and attention-seeking. Grandiose narcissists pursue attention and power, sometimes as politicians, celebrities, or cultural leaders. Of course, not everyone who pursues these positions of power is narcissistic. Many do it for very positive reasons, like reaching their full potential or helping make people's lives better. But narcissistic individuals seek power for the status and attention that goes with it. Meanwhile, vulnerable narcissists can be quiet and reserved. They have a strong sense of entitlement, but are easily threatened or slighted. In either case, the dark side of narcissism shows up over the long term. Narcissists tend to act selfishly, so narcissistic leaders may make risky or unethical decisions, and narcissistic partners may be dishonest or unfaithful. When their rosy view of themselves is challenged, they can become resentful and aggressive. It's like a disease where the sufferers feel pretty good, but the people around them suffer. Taken to the extreme, this behavior is classified as a psychological disorder called narcissistic personality disorder. It affects 1 to 2% of the population, more commonly men. It is also a diagnosis reserved for adults. Young people, especially children, can be very self-centered, but this might just be a normal part of development. The 5th edition of the American Psychiatric Association's Diagnostic and Statistical Manual describes several traits associated with narcissistic personality disorder. They include a grandiose view of oneself, problems with empathy, a sense of entitlement, and a need for admiration or attention. What makes these traits a true personality disorder is that they take over people's lives and cause significant problems. Imagine that instead of caring for your spouse or children, you used them as a source of attention or admiration. Or imagine that instead of seeking constructive feedback about your performance, you instead told everyone who tried to help you that they were wrong. So what causes narcissism? Twin studies show a strong genetic component, although we don't know which genes are involved. But environment matters too. Parents who put their child on a pedestal can foster grandiose narcissism, and cold, controlling parents can contribute to vulnerable narcissism. Narcissism also seems to be higher in cultures that value individuality and self-promotion. In the United States, for example, narcissism as a personality trait has been rising since the 1970s, when the communal focus of the 60s gave way to the self-esteem movement and a rise in materialism. More recently, social media has multiplied the possibilities for self-promotion. Though it's worth noting that there's no clear evidence that social media causes narcissism, rather, it provides narcissists a means to seek social status and attention. So can narcissists improve on those negative traits? Yes. Anything that promotes honest reflection on their own behavior and caring for others, like psychotherapy or practicing compassion towards others, can be helpful. The difficulty is, it can be challenging for people with narcissistic personality disorder to keep working at self-betterment. For a narcissist, self-reflection is hard from an unflattering angle.
There have been many different things written and said about marriage, from the sweetly inspirational to the hilariously cynical. But what many of them have in common is that they sound like they express a universal and timeless truth, when in fact, nearly everything about marriage, from its main purpose to the kinds of relationships it covers to the rights and responsibilities involved, has varied greatly between different eras, cultures, and social classes. So let's take a quick look at the evolution of marriage. Pair bonding and raising children is as old as humanity itself. With the rise of sedentary agricultural societies about 10,000 years ago, marriage was also a way of securing rights to land and property by designating children born under certain circumstances as rightful heirs. As these societies became larger and more complex, marriage became not just a matter between individuals and families, but also an official institution governed by religious and civil authorities. And it was already well established by 2100 BC, when the earliest surviving written laws in the Mesopotamian Code of Ur-Nammu provided many specifics governing marriage, from punishments for adultery to the legal status of children born to slaves. Many ancient civilizations allowed some form of multiple simultaneous marriage, and even today, less than a quarter of the world's hundreds of different cultures prohibit it. But just because something was allowed doesn't mean it was always possible. Demographic realities, as well as the link between marriage and wealth, meant that even though rulers and elites in ancient Mesopotamia, Egypt, and Israel had multiple concubines or wives, most commoners could only afford one or two, tending towards monogamy in practice. In other places, the tables were turned, and a woman could have multiple husbands, as in the Himalayan mountains, where all brothers in a family marrying the same woman kept the small amount of fertile land from being constantly divided into new households. Marriages could vary not only in the number of people they involved, but the types of people as well. Although the names and laws for such arrangements may have differed, publicly recognized same-sex unions have popped up in various civilizations throughout history. Mesopotamian prayers included blessings for such couples, while Native American two-spirit individuals had relationships with both sexes. The first instances of such arrangements actually being called marriage come from Rome, where the emperors Nero and Elagabalus both married men in public ceremonies, with the practice being explicitly banned in 342 AD. But similar traditions survived well into the Christian era, such as adelphopoiesis or brother-making in Orthodox churches, and even an actual marriage between two men recorded in 1061 at a small chapel in Spain. Nor was marriage even necessarily between two living people. Ghost marriages, where either the bride or groom were deceased, were conducted in China to continue family lineages or appease restless spirits, and some tribes in Sudan maintained similar practices. Despite all these differences, a lot of marriages throughout history did have one thing in common. With crucial matters like property and reproduction at stake, they were way too important to depend on young love. Especially among the upper classes, matches were often made by families or rulers. But even for commoners who had some degree of choice, the main concern was practicality. The modern idea of marriage as being mainly about love and companionship only emerged in the last couple of centuries. With industrialization, urbanization, and the growth of the middle class, more people became independent from large extended families and were able to support a new household on their own. Encouraged by new ideas from the Enlightenment, people began to focus on individual happiness and pursuits, rather than familial duty or wealth and status, at least some of the time. And this focus on individual happiness soon led to other transformations, such as easing restrictions on divorce and more people marrying at a later age. So as we continue to debate the role and definition of marriage in the modern world, it might help to keep in mind that marriage has always been shaped by society, and as a society's structure, values, and goals change over time, its ideas of marriage will continue to change along with them.
Humans have been fascinated with speed for ages. The history of human progress is one of ever-increasing velocity, and one of the most important achievements in this historical race was the breaking of the sound barrier. Not long after the first successful airplane flights, pilots were eager to push their planes to go faster and faster. But as they did so, increased turbulence and large forces on the plane prevented them from accelerating further. Some tried to circumvent the problem through risky dives, often with tragic results. Finally, in 1947, design improvements such as a movable horizontal stabilizer, the all-moving tail, allowed an American military pilot named Chuck Yeager to fly the Bell X-1 aircraft at 1,127 kilometers per hour, becoming the first person to break the sound barrier and travel faster than the speed of sound. The Bell X-1 was the first of many supersonic aircraft to follow, with later designs reaching speeds over Mach 3. Aircraft traveling at supersonic speed create a shockwave with a thunder-like noise known as a sonic boom, which can cause distress to people and animals below, or even damage buildings. For this reason, scientists around the world have been looking at sonic booms, trying to predict their path in the atmosphere, where they will land, and how loud they will be. To better understand how scientists study sonic booms, let's start with some basics of sound. Imagine throwing a small stone in a still pond. What do you see? The stone causes waves to travel in the water at the same speed in every direction. These circles that keep growing in radius are called wave fronts. Similarly, even though we cannot see it, a stationary sound source, like a home stereo, creates sound waves traveling outward. The speed of the waves depends on factors like the altitude and temperature of the air they move through. At sea level, sound travels at about 1,225 kilometers per hour. But instead of circles on a two-dimensional surface, the wave fronts are now concentric spheres, with the sound traveling along rays perpendicular to these waves. Now imagine a moving sound source, such as a train whistle. As the source keeps moving in a certain direction, the successive waves in front of it will become bunched closer together. This greater wave frequency is the cause of the famous Doppler effect, where approaching objects sound higher pitched. But as long as the source is moving slower than the sound waves themselves, they will remain nested within each other. It's when an object goes supersonic, moving faster than the sound it makes, that the picture changes dramatically. As it overtakes sound waves it has emitted while generating new ones from its current position, the waves are forced together, forming a Mach cone. No sound is heard as it approaches an observer because the object is traveling faster than the sound it produces. Only after the object has passed will the observer hear the sonic boom. Where the Mach cone meets the ground, it forms a hyperbola, leaving a trail known as the boom carpet as it travels forward. This makes it possible to determine the area affected by a sonic boom. What about figuring out how strong a sonic boom will be? This involves solving the famous Navier-Stokes equations to find the variation of pressure in the air due to the supersonic aircraft flying through it. This results in the pressure signature known as the N wave. What does this shape mean? Well, the sonic boom occurs when there is a sudden change in pressure, and the N wave involves two booms, one for the initial pressure rise at the aircraft's nose, and another for when the tail passes and the pressure suddenly returns to normal. This causes a double boom, but it is usually heard as a single boom by human ears. In practice, computer models using these principles can often predict the location and intensity of sonic booms for given atmospheric conditions and flight trajectories, and there is ongoing research to mitigate their effects. In the meantime, supersonic flight over land remains prohibited. So are sonic booms a recent creation? Not exactly. While we try to find ways to silence them, a few other animals have been using sonic booms to their advantage. The gigantic Diplodocus may have been capable of cracking its tail faster than sound, at over 1,200 kilometers per hour, possibly to deter predators. Some types of shrimp can also create a similar shock wave underwater, stunning or even killing prey at a distance with just a snap of their oversized claw. So while we humans have made great progress in our relentless pursuit of speed, it turns out that nature was there first.
Imagine two people are listening to music. What are the odds that they are listening to the exact same playlist? Probably pretty low. After all, everyone has very different tastes in music. Now, what are the odds that your body will need the exact same medical care and treatment as another person's body? Even lower. As we go through our lives, each of us will have very different needs for our own health care. Scientists and doctors are constantly researching ways to make medicine more personalized. One way they are doing this is by researching stem cells. Stem cells are cells that are undifferentiated, meaning they do not have a specific job or function. While skin cells protect your body, muscle cells contract, and nerve cells send signals, stem cells do not have any specific structures or functions. Stem cells do have the potential to become all other kinds of cells in your body. Your body uses stem cells to replace worn-out cells when they die. For example, you completely replace the lining of your intestines every 4 days. Stem cells beneath the lining of your intestines replace these cells as they wear out. Scientists hope that stem cells could be used to create a very special kind of personalized medicine in which we could replace your own body parts with, well, your own body parts. Stem cell researchers are working hard to find ways in which to use stem cells to create new tissue to replace the parts of organs that are damaged by injury or disease. Using stem cells to replace damaged bodily tissue is called regenerative medicine. For example, scientists currently use stem cells to treat patients with blood diseases such as leukemia. Leukemia is a form of cancer that affects your bone marrow. Bone marrow is the spongy tissue inside your bones where your blood cells are created. In leukemia, some of the cells inside your bone marrow grow uncontrollably, crowding out the healthy stem cells that form your blood cells. Some leukemia patients can receive a stem cell transplant. These new stem cells will create the blood cells needed by the patient's body. There are actually multiple kinds of stem cells that scientists can use for medical treatments and research. Adult stem cells, or tissue-specific stem cells, are found in small numbers in most of your body's tissues. Tissue-specific stem cells replace the existing cells in your organs as they wear out and die. Embryonic stem cells are created from leftover embryos that are willingly donated by patients from fertility clinics. Unlike tissue-specific stem cells, embryonic stem cells are pluripotent. This means that they can be grown into any kind of tissue in the body. A third kind of stem cells is called induced pluripotent stem cells. These are regular skin, fat, liver, or other cells that scientists have changed to behave like embryonic stem cells. Like embryonic stem cells, they too can become any kind of cell in the body. While scientists and doctors hope to use all of these kinds of stem cells to create new tissue to heal your body, they can also use stem cells to help understand how the body works. Scientists can watch stem cells develop into tissue to understand the mechanisms that the body uses to create new tissue in a controlled and regulated way. Scientists hope that with more research, they can not only develop specialized medicine that is specific to your body, but also better understand how your body functions, both when it's healthy and when it's not.
What if I told you there were trillions of tiny bacteria all around you? It's true. Microorganisms called bacteria were some of the first life forms to appear on Earth. Though they consist of only a single cell, their total biomass is greater than that of all plants and animals combined. And they live virtually everywhere, on the ground, in the water, on your kitchen table, on your skin, even inside you. Don't reach for the panic button just yet. Although you have 10 times more bacterial cells inside you than your body has human cells, many of these bacteria are harmless or even beneficial, helping digestion and immunity. But there are a few bad apples that can cause harmful infections, from minor inconveniences to deadly epidemics. Fortunately, there are amazing medicines designed to fight bacterial infections. Synthesized from chemicals or occurring naturally in things like mold, these antibiotics kill or neutralize bacteria by interrupting cell wall synthesis or interfering with vital processes like protein synthesis, all while leaving human cells unharmed. The deployment of antibiotics over the course of the 20th century has rendered many previously dangerous diseases easily treatable. But today, more and more of our antibiotics are becoming less effective. Did something go wrong to make them stop working? The problem is not with the antibiotics, but the bacteria they were made to fight. And the reason lies in Darwin's theory of natural selection. Just like any other organisms, individual bacteria can undergo random mutations. Many of these mutations are harmful or useless, but every now and then one comes along that gives its organism an edge in survival. And for a bacterium, a mutation making it resistant to a certain antibiotic gives quite the edge. As the non-resistant bacteria are killed off, which happens especially quickly in antibiotic-rich environments like hospitals, there is more room and resources for the resistant ones to thrive, passing along only the mutated genes that helped them do so. Reproduction isn't the only way to do this. Some can release their DNA upon death to be picked up by other bacteria, while others use a method called conjugation, connecting through pili to share their genes. Over time, the resistant genes proliferate, creating entire strains of resistant superbacteria. So how much time do we have before these superbugs take over? Well, in some bacteria, it's already happened. For instance, some strands of Staphylococcus aureus, which causes everything from skin infections to pneumonia and sepsis, have developed into MRSA, becoming resistant to beta-lactam antibiotics like penicillin, methicillin, and oxacillin. Thanks to a gene that replaces the protein beta-lactams normally target and bind to, MRSA can keep making its cell walls unimpeded. Other superbacteria, like Salmonella, even sometimes produce enzymes like beta-lactamase that break down antibiotic attackers before they can do any damage. And E. coli, a diverse group of bacteria that contains strains that cause diarrhea and kidney failure, can prevent the function of antibiotics like quinolones by actively booting any invaders that manage to enter the cell. But there is good news. Scientists are working to stay one step ahead of the bacteria. And although development of new antibiotics has slowed in recent years, the World Health Organization has made it a priority to develop novel treatments. Other scientists are investigating alternate solutions, such as phage therapy or using vaccines to prevent infections. Most importantly, curbing the excessive and unnecessary use of antibiotics, such as for minor infections that can resolve on their own, as well as changing medical practice to prevent hospital infections, can have a major impact by keeping more non-resistant bacteria alive as competition for resistant strains. In the war against superbacteria, de-escalation may sometimes work better than an evolutionary arms race.
This is Zeno of Elea, an ancient Greek philosopher famous for inventing a number of paradoxes, arguments that seem logical but whose conclusion is absurd or contradictory. For more than 2,000 years, Zeno's mind-bending riddles have inspired mathematicians and philosophers to better understand the nature of infinity. One of the best known of Zeno's problems is called the dichotomy paradox, which means the paradox of cutting in two in ancient Greek. It goes something like this. After a long day of sitting around thinking, Zeno decides to walk from his house to the park. The fresh air clears his mind and helps him think better. In order to get to the park, he first has to get halfway to the park. This portion of his journey takes some finite amount of time. Once he gets to the halfway point, he needs to walk half the remaining distance. Again, this takes a finite amount of time. Once he gets there, he still needs to walk half the distance that's left, which takes another finite amount of time. This happens again and again and again. You can see that we can keep going like this forever, dividing whatever distance is left into smaller and smaller pieces, each of which takes some finite time to traverse. So, how long does it take Zeno to get to the park? Well, to find out, we need to add the times of each of the pieces of the journey. The problem is, there are infinitely many of these finite-sized pieces. So, shouldn't the total time be infinity? This argument, by the way, is completely general. It says that travelling from any location to any other location should take an infinite amount of time. In other words, it says that all motion is impossible. This conclusion is clearly absurd, but where's the flaw in the logic? To resolve the paradox, it helps to turn the story into a math problem. Let's suppose that Zeno's house is 1 mile from the park, and that Zeno walks at 1 mile per hour. Common sense tells us that the time for the journey should be 1 hour. But let's look at things from Zeno's point of view and divide up the journey into pieces. The first half of the journey takes half an hour. The next part takes quarter of an hour. The third part takes an eighth of an hour, and so on. Summing up all these times, we get a series that looks like this. Now, Zeno might say, since there are infinitely many terms on the right-hand side of the equation, and each individual term is finite, the sum should equal infinity, right? This is the problem with Zeno's argument. As mathematicians have since realized, it is possible to add up infinitely many finite-sized terms and still get a finite answer. How, you ask? Well, let's think of it this way. Let's start with a square that has area 1 unit. Now let's chop the square in half, and then chop the remaining half in half, and so on. While we're doing this, let's keep track of the areas of the pieces. The first slice makes 2 parts, each with an area of 1/2. The next slice divides one of those halves in half, and so on. But no matter how many times we slice up the boxes, the total area is still the sum of the areas of all the pieces. Now you can see why we chose this particular way of cutting up the square. We've obtained the same infinite series as we had for the time of Zeno's journey. As we construct more and more blue pieces, to use the math jargon, as we take the limit as n tends to infinity, the entire square becomes covered with blue. But the area of the square is just one unit, and so the infinite sum must equal 1. Going back to Zeno's journey, we can now see how the paradox is resolved. Not only does the infinite series sum to a finite answer, but that finite answer is the same one that common sense tells us is true. Zeno's journey takes 1 hour.
An enduring myth says we use only 10% of our brain, the other 90% standing idly by for spare capacity. Hucksters promise to unlock that hidden potential with methods based on neuroscience, but all they really unlock is your wallet. 2/3 of the public and nearly half of science teachers mistakenly believe the 10% myth. In the 1890s, William James, the father of American psychology, said, "Most of us do not meet our mental potential." James meant this as a challenge, not an indictment of scant brain usage. But the misunderstanding stuck. Also, scientists couldn't figure out for a long time the purpose of our massive frontal lobes, or broad areas of the parietal lobe. Damage didn't cause motor or sensory deficits, so authorities concluded they didn't do anything. For decades, these parts were called silent areas, their function elusive. We've since learned that they underscore executive and integrative ability, without which we would hardly be human. They're crucial to abstract reasoning, planning, weighing decisions, and flexibly adapting to circumstances. The idea that 9/10 of your brain sits idly by in your skull looks silly when we calculate how the brain uses energy. Rodent and canine brains consume 5% of total body energy. Monkey brains use 10%. An adult human brain, which accounts for only 2% of the body's mass, consumes 20% of daily glucose burned. In children, that figure is 50%, and in infants, 60%. This is far more than expected for their relative brain sizes, which scale in proportion to body size. Human ones weigh 1.5 kilograms, elephant brains 5 kilograms, and whale brains 9 kilograms. Yet on a per-weight basis, humans pack in more neurons than any other species. This dense packing is what makes us so smart. There is a trade-off between body size and the number of neurons a primate, including us, can sustain. A 25-kilogram ape has to eat 8 hours a day to uphold a brain with 53 billion neurons. The invention of cooking 1.5 million years ago gave us a huge advantage. Cooked food is rendered soft and pre-digested outside of the body. Our guts more easily absorb its energy. Cooking frees up time and provides more energy than if we ate foodstuffs raw. And so we can sustain brains with 86 billion densely packed neurons, 40% more than the ape. Here's how it works. Half the calories a brain burns go towards simply keeping the structure intact by pumping sodium and potassium ions across membranes to maintain an electrical charge. To do this, the brain has to be an energy hog. It consumes an astounding 3.4 times 10 to the 21st power ATP molecules per minute. ATP being the coal of the body's furnace. The high cost of maintaining resting potentials in all 86 billion neurons means that little energy is left to propel signals down axons and across synapses, the nerve discharges that actually get things done. Even if only a tiny percentage of neurons fired in a given region at any one time, the energy burden of generating spikes over the entire brain would be unsustainable. Here's where energy efficiency comes in. Letting just a small proportion of cells signal at any one time, known as sparse coding, uses the least energy but carries the most information, because the small number of signals have thousands of possible paths by which to distribute themselves. A drawback of sparse coding within a huge number of neurons is its cost. Worse, if a big proportion of cells never fire, then they are superfluous, and evolution should have jettisoned them long ago. The solution is to find the optimum proportion of cells that the brain can have active at once. For maximum efficiency, between 1% and 16% of cells should be active at any given moment. This is the energy limit we have to live with in order to be conscious at all. The need to conserve resources is the reason most of the brain's operations must happen outside of consciousness. It's why multitasking is a fool's errand. We simply lack the energy to do 2 things at once, let alone 3 or 5. When we try, we do each task less well than if we'd given it our full attention. The numbers are against us. Your brain is already smart and powerful, so powerful that it needs a lot of power to stay powerful, and so smart that it has built in an energy efficiency plan. So don't let a fraudulent myth make you guilty about your supposedly lazy brain. Guilt would be a waste of energy. After all this, don't you realize it's dumb to waste mental energy? You have billions of power-hungry neurons to maintain, so hop to it. Maybe you've recently seen the phrase gluten-free on food packaging, or takeout menus, shampoo bottles, apartment listings, the tag of your shirt, on a hammer, as a lower back tattoo, or in your friend's resume. Next time someone starts telling you about their newfound freedom from gluten, here are some questions you can ask, and the well-informed answers that your friend, being a reasonable individual making educated dietary choices, and by no means just following the latest diet craze, will tell you. What is gluten? Gluten is an insoluble protein composite made up of 2 proteins named gliadin and glutenin. Where might you encounter gluten? Gluten is found in certain grains, particularly wheat, rye, and barley. What has gluten been doing for the previous entirety of human history? And why do you suddenly care about it? Gluten is responsible for the elastic consistency of dough and the chewiness of foods made from wheat flour, like bread and pasta. For some people, these foods cause problems, namely wheat allergy, celiac disease, and non-celiac gluten sensitivity. Wheat allergy is an uncommon condition that occurs when a person's immune system mounts an allergic response to wheat proteins, leading to mild problems and, in rare cases, a potentially dangerous reaction called anaphylaxis. Celiac disease is an inherited disease in which eating foods with gluten leads to inflammation and damage of the lining of the small intestine. This impairs intestinal function, leading to problems like belly pain, bloating, gas, diarrhea, weight loss, skin rash, bone problems like osteoporosis, iron deficiency, small stature, infertility, fatigue, and depression. Untreated, celiac disease increases the risk of developing certain types of cancer. Celiac disease is present in 1 in every 100 to 200 persons in the U.S. When blood tests suggest the possibility of celiac, the diagnosis is confirmed with a biopsy. The most effective treatment is a gluten-free diet, which helps heal intestinal damage and improve symptoms. Some people don't have celiac disease or a wheat allergy, but still experience symptoms when they eat foods with gluten. These people have non-celiac gluten sensitivity. They experience painful gut symptoms and suffer from fatigue, brain fog, joint pain, or skin rash. A gluten-free diet typically helps with these symptoms. So how many people actually have this gluten sensitivity you speak of? Gluten sensitivity's occurrence in the general population is unclear, but likely much more common than wheat allergy or celiac disease. Diagnosis is based on the development of symptoms, the absence of wheat allergy and celiac disease, and subsequent improvement on a gluten-free diet. There's no reliable blood or tissue test, partly because gluten sensitivity isn't a single disease and has a number of different possible causes. For example, it may be the case that gluten can activate the immune system in the small intestine or cause it to become leaky. But sometimes people claiming gluten sensitivity are actually sensitive not to wheat proteins, but sugars found in wheat and other foods called fructans. The human intestine can't break down or absorb fructans, so they make their way to the large intestine or colon, where they're fermented by bacteria, producing short-chain fatty acids and gases. This leads to unpleasant symptoms in some people with bowel problems. Another possible explanation behind gluten sensitivity is the nocebo effect. This occurs when a person believes something will cause problems, and because of that belief, it does. It's the opposite of the more well-known and much more fortuitous placebo effect. Given how much bad press gluten is getting in the media, the nocebo response may play a role for some people who think they're sensitive to gluten. For all these reasons, it's clear that the problems people develop when they eat wheat and other grains aren't exclusively due to gluten. So a better name than non-celiac gluten sensitivity might be wheat intolerance. Okay, so if instead of telling people you're gluten-free, you had to tell them you're wheat intolerant, would I still have to hear about it as often as I do now? Your gluten sensitivity is coming off as wheat intolerance. It's often said that despite humanity's many conflicts, we all bleed the same blood. It's a nice thought, but not quite accurate. In fact, our blood comes in a few different varieties. Our red blood cells contain a protein called hemoglobin that binds to oxygen, allowing the cells to transport it throughout the body. But they also have another kind of complex protein on the outside of the cell membrane. These proteins, known as antigens, communicate with white blood cells, immune cells that protect against infection. Antigens serve as identifying markers, allowing the immune system to recognize your body's own cells without attacking them as foreign bodies. The two main kinds of antigens, A and B, determine your blood type. But how do we get 4 blood types from only 2 antigens? Well, the antigens are coded for by 3 different alleles, varieties of a particular gene. While the A and B alleles code for A and B antigens, the O allele codes for neither. And because we inherit one copy of each gene from each parent, every individual has 2 alleles determining blood type. When these happen to be different, one overrides the other, depending on their relative dominance. For blood types, the A and B alleles are both dominant, while O is recessive. So A and A gives you type A blood, while B and B gives you type B. If you inherit one of each, the resulting co-dominance will produce both A and B antigens, which is type AB. The O allele is recessive, so either of the others will override it when they're paired, resulting in either type A or type B. But if you happen to inherit 2 O's, instructions will be expressed that make blood cells without the A or the B antigen. Because of these interactions, knowing both parents' blood types lets us predict the relative probability of their children's blood types. Why do blood types matter? For blood transfusions, finding the correct one is a matter of life and death. If someone with type A blood is given type B blood, or vice versa, their antibodies will reject the foreign antigens and attack them, potentially causing the transfused blood to clot. But because people with type AB blood produce both A and B antigens, they don't make antibodies against them, so they will recognize either as safe, making them universal recipients. On the other hand, people with blood type O do not produce either antigen, which makes them universal donors, but will cause their immune system to make antibodies that reject any other blood type. Unfortunately, matching donors and recipients is a bit more complicated due to additional antigen systems, particularly the Rh factor, named after the rhesus monkeys in which it was first isolated. Rh plus or Rh minus refers to the presence or absence of the D antigen of the Rh blood group system. And in addition to impeding some blood transfusions, it can cause severe complications in pregnancy. If an Rh negative mother is carrying an Rh positive child, her body will produce Rh antibodies that may cross the placenta and attack the fetus, a condition known as hemolytic disease of the newborn. Some cultures believe blood type to be associated with personality, though this is not supported by science. And though the proportions of different blood types vary between human populations, scientists aren't sure why they evolved, perhaps as protection against blood-borne diseases, or due to random genetic drift. Finally, different species have different sets of antigens. In fact, the 4 main blood types shared by us apes seem paltry in comparison to the 13 types found in dogs. Around 1159 AD, a mathematician called Bhaskara the Learned sketched a design for a wheel containing curved reservoirs of mercury. He reasoned that as the wheel spun, the mercury would flow to the bottom of each reservoir, leaving one side of the wheel perpetually heavier than the other. The imbalance would keep the wheel turning forever. Bhaskara's drawing was one of the earliest designs for a perpetual motion machine, a device that can do work indefinitely without any external energy source. Imagine a windmill that produced the breeze it needed to keep rotating, or a light bulb whose glow provided its own electricity. These devices have captured many inventors' imaginations because they could transform our relationship with energy. For example, if you could build a perpetual motion machine that included humans as part of its perfectly efficient system, it could sustain life indefinitely. There's just one problem. They don't work. Ideas for perpetual motion machines all violate one or more fundamental laws of thermodynamics, the branch of physics that describes the relationship between different forms of energy. The first law of thermodynamics says that energy can't be created or destroyed. You can't get out more energy than you put in. That rules out a useful perpetual motion machine right away, because a machine could only ever produce as much energy as it consumed. There wouldn't be any left over to power a car or charge a phone. But what if you just wanted the machine to keep itself moving? Inventors have proposed plenty of ideas. Several of these have been variations on Bhaskara's overbalanced wheel, with rolling balls or weights on swinging arms. None of them work. The moving parts that make one side of the wheel heavier also shift its center of mass downward below the axle. With a low center of mass, the wheel just swings back and forth like a pendulum, then stops. What about a different approach? In the 17th century, Robert Boyle came up with an idea for a self-watering pot. He theorized that capillary action, the attraction between liquids and surfaces that pulls water through thin tubes, might keep the water cycling around the bowl. But if the capillary action is strong enough to overcome gravity and draw the water up, it would also prevent it from falling back into the bowl. Then there are versions with magnets, like this set of ramps. The ball is supposed to be pulled upwards by the magnet at the top, fall back down through the hole, and repeat the cycle. This one fails because, like the self-watering pot, the magnet would simply hold the ball at the top. Even if it somehow did keep moving, the magnet's strength would degrade over time and eventually stop working. For each of these machines to keep moving, they'd have to create some extra energy to nudge the system past its stopping point, breaking the first law of thermodynamics. There are ones that seem to keep going, but in reality, they invariably turn out to be drawing energy from some external source. Even if engineers could somehow design a machine that didn't violate the first law of thermodynamics, it still wouldn't work in the real world because of the second law. The second law of thermodynamics tells us that energy tends to spread out through processes like friction. Any real machine would have moving parts or interactions with air or liquid molecules that would generate tiny amounts of friction and heat, even in a vacuum. That heat is energy escaping, and it would keep leaching out, reducing the energy available to move the system itself until the machine inevitably stopped. So far, these two laws of thermodynamics have stymied every idea for perpetual motion and the dreams of perfectly efficient energy generation they imply. Yet it's hard to conclusively say we'll never discover a perpetual motion machine, because there's still so much we don't understand about the universe. Perhaps we'll find new, exotic forms of matter that'll force us to revisit the laws of thermodynamics. Or maybe there's perpetual motion on tiny quantum scales. What we can be reasonably sure about is that we'll never stop looking. For now, the one thing that seems truly perpetual is our search.
French fries are delicious. French fries with ketchup are a little slice of heaven. The problem is, it's basically impossible to pour exactly the right amount. We're so used to pouring ketchup that we don't realize how weird its behavior is. Imagine a ketchup bottle filled with a straight-up solid like steel. No amount of shaking would ever get the steel out. Now imagine that same bottle full of a liquid like water. That would pour like a dream. Ketchup, though, can't seem to make up its mind. Is it a solid or a liquid? The answer is, it depends. The world's most common fluids, like water, oils, and alcohols, respond to force linearly. If you push on them twice as hard, they move twice as fast. Sir Isaac Newton, of Apple fame, first proposed this relationship, and so those fluids are called Newtonian fluids. Ketchup, though, is part of a merry band of linear rule breakers called non-Newtonian fluids. Mayonnaise, toothpaste, blood, paint, peanut butter, and lots of other fluids respond to force non-linearly. That is, their apparent thickness changes depending on how hard you push, or how long, or how fast. And ketchup is actually non-Newtonian in two different ways. Way number one. The harder you push, the thinner ketchup seems to get. Below a certain pushing force, ketchup basically behaves like a solid. But once you pass that breaking point, it switches gears and becomes 1,000 times thinner than it was before. Sound familiar, right? Way number two. If you push with a force below the threshold force, eventually the ketchup will start to flow. In this case, time, not force, is the key to releasing ketchup from its glassy prison. All right, so why does ketchup act all weird? Well, it's made from tomatoes. Pulverized, smashed, thrashed, utterly destroyed tomatoes. See these tiny particles? This is what remains of tomato cells after they go through the ketchup treatment. And the liquid around those particles, that's mostly water and some vinegar, sugar, and spices. When ketchup is just sitting around, the tomato particles are evenly and randomly distributed. Now let's say you apply a weak force very quickly. The particles bump into each other, but can't get out of each other's way, so the ketchup doesn't flow. Now let's say you apply a strong force very quickly. That extra force is enough to squish the tomato particles, so maybe instead of little spheres, they get smushed into little ellipses. And boom, now you have enough space for one group of particles to get past others, and the ketchup flows. Now let's say you apply a very weak force, but for a very long time. Turns out, we're not exactly sure what happens in this scenario. One possibility is that the tomato particles near the walls of the container slowly get bumped towards the middle, leaving the soup they were dissolved in, which remember is basically water, near the edges. That water serves as a lubricant between the glass bottle and the center plug of ketchup, and so the ketchup flows. Another possibility is that the particles slowly rearrange themselves into lots of small groups, which then flow past each other. Scientists who study fluid flows are still actively researching how ketchup and its merry friends work. Ketchup basically gets thinner the harder you push, but other substances like oobleck or some natural peanut butters actually get thicker the harder you push. Others can climb up rotating rods or continue to pour themselves out of a beaker once you get them started. From a physics perspective, though, ketchup is one of the more complicated mixtures out there, And as if that weren't enough, the balance of ingredients and the presence of natural thickeners like xanthan gum, which is also found in many fruit drinks and milkshakes, can mean that two different ketchups behave completely differently. But most will show two telltale properties: sudden thinning at a threshold force and more gradual thinning after a small force is applied for a long time. And that means you could get ketchup out of the bottle in two ways. Either give it a series of long, slow, languid shakes, making sure you don't ever stop applying force, or you could hit the bottle once, very, very hard. What the real pros do is keep the lid on, give the bottle a few short, sharp shakes to wake up all those tomato particles, and then take the lid off and do a nice controlled pour onto their heavenly fries.
Every spring, hundreds of adventure seekers dream of climbing Chomolungma, also known as Mount Everest. At base camp, they hunker down for months, waiting for the chance to scale the mountain's lofty, lethal peak. But why do people risk life and limb to climb Everest? Is it the challenge? The view? The chance to touch the sky? For many, the draw is Everest's status as the highest mountain on Earth. There's an important distinction to make here. Mauna Kea is actually the tallest from base to summit, but at 8,850 meters above sea level, Everest has the highest altitude on the planet. To understand how this towering formation was born, we have to peer deep into our planet's crust, where continental plates collide. The Earth's surface is like an armadillo's armor. Pieces of crust constantly move over, under, and around each other. For such huge continental plates, the motion is relatively quick. They move 2 to 4 centimeters per year, about as fast as fingernails grow. When two plates collide, one pushes into or underneath the other, buckling at the margins and causing what's known as uplift to accommodate the extra crust. That's how Everest came about. 50 million years ago, the Earth's Indian plate drifted north, bumped into the bigger Eurasian plate, and the crust crumpled, creating huge uplift. Mount Everest lies at the heart of this action, on the edge of the Indian-Eurasian collision zone. But mountains are shaped by forces other than uplift. As the land is pushed up, air masses are forced to rise as well. Rising air cools, causing any water vapor within it to condense and form rain or snow. As that falls, it wears down the landscape, dissolving rocks or breaking them down in a process known as weathering. Water moving downhill carries the weathered material and erodes the landscape, carving out deep valleys and jagged peaks. This balance between uplift and erosion gives a mountain its shape. But compare the celestial peaks of the Himalayas to the comforting hills of Appalachia. Clearly, all mountains are not alike. That's because time comes into the equation too. When continental plates first collide, uplift happens fast. The peaks grow tall with steep slopes. Over time, however, gravity and water wear them down. Eventually, erosion overtakes uplift, wearing down peaks faster than they're pushed up. A third factor shapes mountains: climate. In sub-zero temperatures, some snowfall doesn't completely melt away, instead slowly compacting until it becomes ice. That forms the snow line, which occurs at different heights around the planet, depending on climate. At the freezing poles, the snow line is at sea level. Near the equator, you have to climb 5 kilometers before it gets cold enough for ice to form. Gathered ice starts flowing under its own immense weight, forming a slow-moving frozen river known as a glacier, which grinds the rocks below. The steeper the mountains, the faster ice flows, and the quicker it carves the underlying rock. Glaciers can erode landscapes swifter than rain and rivers. Where glaciers cling to mountain peaks, they sand them down so fast they lop the tops off, like giant snowy buzzsaws. So then, how did the icy Mount Everest come to be so tall? The cataclysmic continental clash from which it arose made it huge to begin with. Secondly, The mountain lies near the tropics, so the snow line is high and the glaciers relatively small, barely big enough to whittle it down. The mountain exists in a perfect storm of conditions that maintain its impressive stature. But that won't always be the case. We live in a changing world where the continental plates, Earth's climate, and the planet's erosive power might one day conspire to cut Mount Everest down to size. For now, at least, it remains legendary in the minds of hikers, adventurers, and dreamers alike.